Record. All right. So we're officially recording. It's over here. All right. So came to the end of the semester. You know, I was in the bathroom and I was like, maybe we should have done another week's worth of content. And then I was like, no, I think they would probably have been really sad if we had done that. There's more we could have done for sure, but we did it. We made it through. Is the final, the last hurrah, and you do have your final homework too, right? That you're working on, which is due. I think we said Monday. Yeah, and then the final is Wednesday. Yeah, you can have till 5. What? The homework. Oh, not the final. Were you like, oh my God, yeah. Yeah, no. No, the homework's due at the end of the day, Monday. You can have till the end of the day, Monday, for sure. All right. So we've made it. So really the big thing is to talk about the final today and to do, whatever review you would like to do. I'm hoping that people have brought questions and things like that. I did put together a little study guide that I think kind of outlines what I think are some of the big points that you should be familiar with for the final. Let's just kind of review what the format of the final is first. It is open book and it is open notes. So you can use any resources you want, no going out online and no communicating with other people, right? But if you have resources electronically and you want to access them electronically, that's fine. I just ask that you don't go out on the internet. So you can use anything, basically, anything that you've accumulated over the last semester. So you don't have to try to memorize stuff, right? Just have to understand stuff. It's about, I think there are about 10 multiple choice questions, and then there are about 12, I believe, short, very, very short answer questions. So things that can be not like essays, things that can be answered either with fill in the blanks or with like a sentence. So there are some open-ended, so it's about half open-ended, slightly more than half open-ended, about slightly less than half multiple choice. I don't think it will take you the whole time. I'm sure hoping that it doesn't. It's really hard, right? To predict. Here's my prediction. Somebody in the class will finish in an hour. There will be somebody in the class from whom I have to rip the paper out of their tight little fist, right? And the rest of you will be and most of the rest of you will be somewhere. Yeah, exactly. It'll be a nice normal curve, right? Most of the rest of you will be somewhere in between that. So, I think if you know the content well, like it's not a long test to take. So, you know it and you can whip through it. You'll be done in like an hour, but maybe you want to think about a few of the questions a little more than that because you're not sure. That's fair. So maybe it takes you a little longer than that, but it's not an overly long test. And for those of you who took SEM with me, I think it's a far easier test than the SEM exam was. I was like, is this too easy? But then I was like, no, just go with it. Just go with it. Yeah, so I think it is. I think it's a lot easier than the SEM exam was. So I think they're pretty black and white. I could imagine myself giving partial credit under certain circumstances, right? But I do think that they are not really. They are meant to be like there is an answer key with right and wrong answers. Well, no, not wrong answers. I didn't put wrong answers on the answer key. That'd be weird. But there is an answer key with right answers. So again, like if I felt like you got close, I would give partial credit, but it's not one of those. They're not like, oh, here's this really nebulous scenario. you know, I want to see your best thinking kind of things. I think they're more concrete than that. Other questions about sort of the format of these things? Yes. Uh-huh. I'm sorry, I can't do that. I mean, I think you have the answers that you need from the homework. If I post the answer keys, I've got to start from scratch with homeworks next year, and I cannot tell you how much time it takes to create those homeworks and those keys. It's just not, it's not possible. I mean, there's already sort of security issues, I suppose, but like, I just can't, I can't post all the keys. I don't really think having all the keys would help you that much, personally, because I mean, it's not, this is not just like a rehash of the homework, although there are things from the homework that do appear here. If there are questions about something from the homework that you still don't understand, I would say you should, like, well, A, ask them now, B, make an appointment to talk to me sometime between now and the exam. Like, if there's something on the homework that you're still really confused about, like, now's a good time to get that cleared up. Other questions? Okay, great. So now let's talk about the content of the exam. So did everybody get the study guide? Okay. One more, okay. Okay. Another one? Schedule, it shows that it starts at 8 o'clock in the morning. Yeah. And it says Wednesday at 8 o'clock? Well, no, it's not necessarily. There is an exam time. I thought it was like 8 o'clock on Friday or Saturday or something weird. What? Yeah, that says the 17th, which is like another day. Isn't that like on Saturday or something? Thursday. Yeah. Saturday. It is Saturday, right? Yeah. So the final time slot that we were scheduled for is 8 to 10 a.m. on Saturday, the 17th. So I only go with our regularly scheduled time. I mean, if somebody really wants to take it during the exam slot, I suppose that's your right, but that seemed really harsh and unfun for everybody. So yeah, so it'll be in here. Now, there was somebody, who was it that somebody's got a thing and they need to start early? Well, yeah, Sarah's got a thing and she needs to start early. But I thought there was somebody else who had like who had a GA thing and had asked if they could start like an hour early. No? Last call for that. Okay, nobody here. Maybe it was. Yeah. Yeah. I yeah, there was at least one person I think who needed to start like an hour early. So I will start the exam at 8 for anybody who wants to show up at 8 if you want, because there's one person who needs to start early. If anybody else wants to start early, you can, but you certainly don't have to. So show up sometime between 8 and 9 to start the exam. And we will close promptly at noon. The exam, I mean, that's my goal. So if you think you're going to need more than 3 hours, then maybe you do want to show up a little on the early side. But again, I don't think you should need more than 3 hours. So please don't feel obliged to come at 8 o'clock in the morning. I think we have time limits on especially ones that are open book, because I think there's sometimes the tendency to think like, sometimes people just perseverate about one question, you know? So I'm just going to save you from yourself in that regard, right? Like, basically this, whatever you've done after 3 hours is probably all you're going to, right? Like, you don't know a question, you don't know a question. I mean, it happens to everybody sometimes. So you take your best shot and you move on. I mean, again, I don't think that you're going to have that problem a lot, but anyway, I tell the story. My husband, gives an exam in his 5601 class, and he doesn't give time limits and at all. It's open book and open notes and open resources and no time limits. And this was a few years ago. He gave the exam, and there was this woman who stayed for like over 8 hours. She stayed until midnight. I mean, I really thought he would change his policy after that, but he is a far nicer man than I. He did not. He still allows people unlimited time. But again, it's like, you know, it's not the time to be learning the material. Like, it's the time to be showing your knowledge of the material. And I don't want people to feel rushed. But on the other hand, you know, at a certain point, it's like, okay, it's just time to like let go of that exam and right. Like, it's time to let go of that exam and move on with your life. Anyway, so that's the plan on the timing. All right. So now let's get into content. Okay. So here I prepared a little study guide for you. These are just bullet points of things I think you want to make sure that you review. In terms of how to study, I mean, again, it's open book and it's open notes. You can bring your homework, you can bring your notes, PowerPoints, R markdown files, whatever you want to bring, books, you know, whatever. But I guess one of my big suggestions for you would be, you know, you don't need to memorize anything, right? But it's probably a good idea to spend some time organizing your materials over the next week so that you feel like you know where, you know, maybe your stuff is already organized. I don't know. But if it isn't, it's a good time to organize things so that you sort of know how to get to the things you need to find. And I think this study guide, and by the way, this is in no particular order. It's not in terms of the order on the exam, order of importance, or even chronological order of the class. It's the order in which it occurred to me to put things on the study guide. So don't read anything into the ordering. And I'm not suggesting that you necessarily, I looked at this morning and I was like, I don't know, if I were organizing, this isn't necessarily the order in which I would organize, but these are the things that you should you should be prepared to think about. So things like, you know, if you sort of start at the beginning of the semester, things like, you know, obviously, what is multi-level modeling? What are some of the sort of basic assumptions? What are we basically kind of doing when we're doing multi-level modeling? And then obviously thinking about calculating the intraclass correlation coefficient, and thinking about things like, you know, in that first lecture, we talked about effective sample size, which I think that kind of feeds into power as well. So, right, those kinds of things. Then I think you want to definitely be thinking about how do we interpret both fixed effects and variance components, right? How do we, you know, we spent a lot of time on longitudinal modeling. So I would expect people to be comfortable with, you know, things about how do we code time in longitudinal models? How would we code in terms of coding time? You know, we talked about like coding linear time. We talked about sort of coding discontinuities, like, right, change in level, change in slope. We talked about coding polynomial terms, so things like quadratic or cubic models, right? So I would expect you to be able to do all kinds of different, you know, basic coding like that. And then obviously be able to sort of interpret effects accordingly. I would expect you to sort of have some basic knowledge of sort of nesting. Nothing too crazy high level, right? But we've talked about nesting and nested models. So I'd expect you to sort of know if two different, again, in the context of the things we've talked about in class, I'm not going to give you kind of an example that goes beyond what we've done, determining if models are nested, being able to use the likelihood ratio test, that's what LRT is, which is really that chi-square test, right? Between, you know, the chi-square test and model fit when we compare two different models. And remember, we're only going to use the likelihood ratio test, that chi-square difference test, to compare two models that are nested. We're not going to use that to compare two non-nested models. What might we use to compare two non-nested models instead of like a likelihood ratio test? Yeah, AIC, BIC, fit indices, right? Great. You know, in terms of power, we went into like a lot of gory detail on power in class last week and in the homework. But really, again, I think what the takeaways from power, the most important things for you to know in terms of the exam and going forward are specifically understanding the relationship between like the ICC, the number of clusters, and the within cluster sample size, especially for cluster randomized trials, which I think is, we spent the most time on cluster randomized trials. So that's where you should really focus your energy on power. And I really want you to understand the basics of power for a 2-level kind of cluster randomized trial, right? In terms of, I would expect you to sort of know about the variance reduction formulas that we use, that sort of the Rodden, Bush, and Bright. Remember, we talked about, like, should write on here probably. Hold on. Where do I want to pull up something? Let's see. There we go. Oh, and I need to share screen too. I didn't share screen yet, did I? Let's see. Screen 1, share. Okay, great. Right, there we go. Okay, so remember the Rodden, Bush, and Bright proportion variance reduction formulas that we talked about? Like, wanted to know what proportion of variance, is explained, right? Like, what proportion are we explaining in the intercept variance? We could do something like tau naught for the full model, right? Minus tau naught for the baseline model, divided by tau naught for the baseline model. Or if we wanted to look at the proportion of residual level 1 variance that's explained, we do the same kind of thing. Sigma squared for the full minus sigma squared baseline divided by sigma squared for the baseline, right? So we talked about these kinds of proportion reduction and variance measures, and this is where we're comparing 2 models, right? So this is like the more parsimonious model, the less parameterized model, the simpler model. And then this is going to be the more complex model. We also talked a little bit about, we talked some about Wrights and Sturba and sort of the proportion variance explained measures from Wrights and Sturba. Again, I think we talked more about this, so you can sort of expect to see more about this, but you should have some passing familiarity with Wrights and Sturba and sort of what the goal is there. Let's see, where was I? Yeah, so variance reduction, counting parameters manually, right? We've done that a lot. Like, you've got a model. How many fixed effects are there? How many variance components are there? That's what I mean by that. How many unique elements are there in a variance covariance matrix of a given magnitude, right? And I think we've done that a lot. And so if I said, and does everybody remember like the quickie formula that we've used? Yes. Oh, that's a good question. Well, okay, so what's the difference between a covariance and a correlation? Yeah, correlation is the standardized covariance, right? So it's the same kind of difference that it was way back in Quant 1. Now, R is kind of funky in terms of the output. If you just ask for summary, it will give you get something that and then on the then you'll get over here, right? These are actually correlations. So R just, by default is going to give you correlation. You can actually probably I think the easiest way that I remember to get the covariance is just to, you know how you can say R objective and you can do our core model And then of course you can. And if you do that, you're going to get actually a column in this data frame that has all of the variances and covariances, and then you get another column that has things with like standard deviations and correlation. So if you ask for the variance covariance matrix as a data frame, you'll automatically get both the variance covariances and the correlations. There are other ways. I mean, there are other ways to get what? Yeah, the pretty tables. I think the pretty tables are all correlations too. I mean, that's the other thing you can do, right? You can always, no, not for the final, but for life, it's a good skill to have, right? That's not actually on the final exam, but you could easily go from the correlations to the covariances, because and I think we did talk about that at one point, because the correlations are just the standardized covariances, right? So you can just basically unstandardize. It's not that hard, right? So if you have like the correlation, just use the variances of the two variables. Get back to the covariance. Having said that, that might not work that well in some of those examples, because in some of those examples, the correlations were 1, which is actually like just rounded up to 1. So you probably couldn't actually get back to the covariances maybe as accurate as you might want to. And so I think the best way to get those covariances is, and again, there were no points taken off for it was just, I wanted to point out to everybody that, like, those aren't actually covariances. So what you've given me is what R gives you. So in some sense, like, that's totally understandable, but those aren't technically the covariances, they are the correlations. So if you wanted a covariance matrix, you'd really want to get those covariances. But I mean, I think people tend to interpret, it's much easier to interpret correlations, right? So this is sort of, maybe it's like a technical issue, because the correlations are maybe what you're going to be more interested in, like from an interpretation perspective. All right. So where was I on this? So, yeah, so counting parameters, right? Being able to count fixed effects, variance components, that kind of thing. Be able to do that for both organizational and longitudinal models. How would you even know if you should be using HLM in the first place, right? Or, that kind of goes back to what is a multi-level model. We did talk about reliability. That was way back. I mean, it's come up a few times, but we talked about it in fairly decent detail, I think, back in. So again, there you should sort of understand what's the relationship between, like, the variance components, right? So your taus and sigma square, the cluster size, and the reliability. And the reliability, when we're talking about reliability in a multi-level model, we're really talking about the reliability with which the sample mean is, like, how reliably does the sample mean sort of capture the true mean? So it's really the reliability with which the sample mean can estimate the true, like, cluster mean. Often we think about this in terms of, like, the intercepts. Again, we talked about it in terms of an unconditional model. Does everybody remember? Okay, I should come back over here, right? It's actually recorded. So let's just say we have an unconditional model. So let's say we've got tau not, right? What is tau not in an unconditional model? Unconditional organizational model, let's say we've got kids nested within schools, and we're looking at some sort of achievement. So totally unconditional model, right? Well, first, what does our unconditional model look like? Ij is equal to gamma not plus j plus r sub ij, right? So this is like a completely unconditional model. What do we do with the completely unconditional model? Why do I always estimate this model as dumb as it seems? Always my first model when I'm running a multi-level model. Why? Well, that's true. So I have something to compare other things against, sure. For the ICC, yeah, exactly. Like even if you have no other reason for estimating this, this is the model that gives you the ICC, right? And we know that the variance of not J is, what's the variance in use of not J? Not. Thanks. And the variance in R sub ij is sigma squared. Excellent. And how do I get the ICC? Not divided by no minuses plus sigma squared. That's right. No minuses in the ICD. And right. So remember, this is the between cluster variance, and it's the between cluster variance divided by the whole variance. Is that, you know, if you were to look at this total, get the total, it is going to be, again, this is maximum likelihood estimation, so it's not necessarily going to be exact to the 15th decimal place, but this is going to be a, you know, basically a very super close approximation to the variance that you would get if you just computed the sample variance. Like, it's going to be virtually spot. It's going to either be spot on or virtually spot on. And so that means actually my things are the standard deviation of my y, right? And that's why this is on the bottom. It's just total variance. It's the total variance. And this is the between cluster variance. So what proportion of the total variance lies between clusters? How much is cluster explaining of my total variance? How much should the cluster be explaining of my total variance if I want to use multiple regression instead of multi-level modeling? Let's say I have had enough of this class and I never want to do this again. So I'm going to estimate this model, get the ICC, and then I'm really hoping that I can just do a multiple regression. 0, that's right. An ICC of 0, that's complete independence, right? The cluster explains none of the variance in the outcome variable. Anything above 0 is actually indicative of non-independence, right? Now you could say to yourself, well, I don't know, right? What if it's 0.00001? Okay, well maybe I don't care if it's 0.001, but I think I've shown you a lot of figures that would suggest that even ICCs as low as 0.01 can be problematic, especially remember when you have large cluster sizes. And remember, that goes back to that formula for the N effective that we've talked about. So, okay, now I forget. Oh, yes, reliability. Okay, so here's my unconditional model, right? Anybody remember the formula for reliability? Reliability is that same tau not squared over n sub j. And remember, we actually get a reliability for every cluster. And every cluster has a potentially different n sub j. And this reliability is the reliability with which the cluster mean, like how good an estimate of the cluster is the cluster mean of the true score, of the true mean. So like the reliability with which the cluster mean estimates the true mean. And that kind of makes sense, right? If I've got very few people in my cluster, and I gave this example way back, if I have only like 2 people in a cluster, right? Then this, remember, the C squared is within cluster variability, within cluster residual variability, but in this case, we don't really have any variables, so it's just within cluster variability. And so if there's a lot of within cluster variability, then the more people that I sample from the cluster, the better estimate I'm going to get of that cluster mean. Whereas if there's very little within cluster variability, it doesn't take very many people actually to get a good estimate of the cluster mean, right? Imagine the most extreme circumstance where everybody in the cluster is identical. There's no within cluster variance. So everybody gets the same score within a cluster. Well, if everybody got the same score within a cluster, sigma squared would be 0, right? Then it doesn't matter how many people you have in a cluster because your reliability is 1, right? Tau naught naught divided by tau naught naught. Now imagine the sigma squared is huge. That means there's tons of variability between different people in the same cluster. So different kids in the same school have radically different scores from each other. Now it's going to matter how many people I sample from that cluster to get a reliable estimate of the true cluster mean, right? And so the bigger this, if this is at least, if this is really big, right, then it's going to take a really big sample size actually to get a decent reliability. And again, remember, this doesn't vary across clusters. So the only thing that's changing across our clusters is n sub j. So we've got this estimate of sigma squared. We're assuming that the within cluster variance is like equal or approximately equal across clusters. So for a given sigma squared, the bigger the sample size, what happens to reliability? If sample size gets bigger, then this whole thing gets smaller. And if this whole thing gets smaller, then this whole thing gets bigger, right? And so again, as n sub j goes to infinity, if you sort of imagine if you had a huge number of people per cluster, this entire term would again go down to 0, and then you'd have a reliability of 1, right? So those are sort of some of the things that really impact reliability. Okay, so now let's just think about this for a minute, though. That's the unconditional model. What happens if I put predictors in my model now? Think about everything you know about sigma squared and tau. And let's imagine I fit a model where I put in a bunch of level 1 predictors and they're good predictors. Okay, the organizational model, I put in a bunch of student level predictors and they're good predictors. What's going to happen to the sigma squared for that model? Because now it's the residual, right? Now it really is the residual level 1 variance. The sigma squared is going to go down, right? Okay, so the sigma squared goes down. So if I were to compute the reliability for that model with a bunch of really good level 1 predictors, how would that reliability compare to the reliability for the model that had no predictors? Yeah, go up, right? Because I'm explaining a lot of that level 1 residual variance. That's good. So I'm explaining why people are different from each other within the cluster, right? Bringing that residual variance down, reliability goes up. Okay. What about, so that's true. Now let's take a different scenario. What about if I put in a bunch of level 2 predictors and they're good predictors? So they explain why schools are different from each other. Got all these, school level variables that explain why schools differ from each other. What happens to tau naught naught? When I explain a bunch of it, goes down, right? If I have a bunch of great predictors, tau naught naught goes down. Remember, we know that because we just talked about that. Baseline. This is how much smaller, it depends on how good my predictors are, right? But if I have a bunch of really good predictors, this tau naught naught should shrink quite a bit. Okay, well, what does that mean in terms of reliability then? Let's just assume sigma squared has not changed. We put in a bunch of level 2 predictors. We're using the same sigma squared as like whatever the last model is we're comparing to. What happens to reliability? Yeah, you all are like looking really sad, but I see people saying down, see a couple people saying up, but think about it, right? if this tau naught naught is smaller and this tau naught naught is smaller, right, and this thing stays the same size, then actually the reliability is going to go down as you add level 2 predictors to the model. So the reliability goes down. That feels weird, right? But what does that really mean? Well, the reliability really tells us about how much emphasis we should put on the sort of the model-based estimate, right, versus the sample estimate. And the better job your model does of explaining what's going on, the more emphasis you're actually going to put on the model-based estimate. And in fact, if you think about it, if you got to a point where you could explain all of the between cluster variance in an outcome variable, right? Like you have so many good predictors that you can explain all of the between cluster variance in the outcome variable, tau naught naught would go down to 0. And your reliability would be 0. Seems weird, but you know, it's not actually weird. And what would that be telling you? If your tau naught naught is 0 and your reliability is 0, you need a multi-level model? Like, yeah, no,
You just need it.
yeah, right. Like you've gotten to a point where if you can get to a point in your models, this like almost never happens with the intercept, but if you can get to a point in your models where like the model explains all of the between cluster variance, and I'm talking about the intercept, but this would hold true for slopes too. You can get to a point where you can explain all the between cluster variance and the slopes or the intercepts, then remember, then we can get rid of that variance component, we can simplify the model. Right? So you could get rid of a randomly varying slope, or in this case, you could get rid of a randomly varying intercept. And if you could get rid of all of your randomly varying slopes and all of your randomly varying intercepts, that would take you right back to multiple regression. I mean, again, this does not usually happen. Usually when you need like when you start multi-level modeling, it's pretty unusual for you to actually be able to explain all of the variance in your model. But again, it might seem weird that the reliability is going down as you're explaining more level 2 variance. But again, what you're really talking about the reliability for the conditional model there. And now conditional on those level 2 variables, like the clusters aren't that different from each other anymore, which again might seem weird, but is also a really good thing. Because, right? Makes sense? Okay. When would you use the reliability?
Yeah.
Well, remember, and we talked about when we did residuals, I think I showed you how you compute the reliabilities, right? I find the reliability estimates to be really, I mean, I think I tend to probably use them more for like the unconditional model, just to kind of get a sense of how reliably I can estimate, how reliably the sample mean estimates the true school mean or the true clustering. And so if you're sort of interested in that aspect, then you kind of want to look at that with the unconditional model. But I think the other place that reliability can be helpful is if you find that the reliability, I mean, in some sense, you could see this with tau as well, but reliability kind of gives you another metric. If you have a model and you find that the reliability is dipping down to something close to 0, that's actually a sign that you might not need that variance component. Like you might not need that tau or, that tau naught naught or that tau 101. And so like, we didn't spend a lot of time on that in class. It'd be nice if, it would be really nice if R gave you like the average reliability for each, for each of your variance, for each of those parameters, which it doesn't. You'd have to like compute it by hand. But I mean, I would say that's like one difference between HLM and R is that like in HLM, you actually get those average reliabilities. So it's really quick and easy to use them as a diagnostic. And like, if you see that one of them's falling below 0.05, you say, maybe I don't need that variance component anymore. We didn't really do that because we don't get that as easily. We looked more just at the taus, but you could absolutely use reliabilities to do that. And maybe someday R will just like pop them out easily. That would be nice. All right. Okay, so I went off on a tangent there, but yeah, okay. So obviously, as you can kind of guess, if I gave you a description, sort of a verbal description of a model, like there are this many level 1 variables and this many level 2 variables and this many, these are the things that randomly vary, I would expect you to be able to write a model equation both in multi-level. I mean, I can guarantee that's a question on the exam. I'll tell you that right now, right? Both in multi-level format and combined format. But we've done that a lot, so I feel like you'll be good there. All right, is centering. I mean, I would, again, there's a lot to know about centering, but I think broad brushstrokes are important at this point. I would expect you to understand the difference between like grand mean and group mean centering and what kinds of implications that has for sort of model interpretation, and how centering impact, again, in general, how centering impacts variance component, estimates for variance components and fixed effects. Let's see. In terms of adding predictors to a model, right? Sort of understanding how to add predictors to a model, thinking about coding for predictors, in addition to centering, and what coding means in terms of how you interpret results. So for example, if you had a dichotomous variable and it's dummy coded, what does that mean about how you interpret the parameter, that kind of thing. And decision making, yes, sorry, go ahead. Yeah, so, sorry. Well, dichotomous variables can be coded a lot of different ways. So one of the more popular ways that you code dichotomous variables is dummy coding. That's the one that we've used most of all. I think it's the one that people are. And in dummy coding, like let's say we have a variable like male, right? And we code it 0 to 1, so that, and I told you whenever I use coded variable, I would make it so that the name is 1. So this would be like a variable where male is 1, female is 0, right? And so that means that female, again, reason that it matters is because in a regression model, and multi-level regression is regression, intercept is the predicted value and everything in the model is 0. So when we dummy code, we've got the variable in the model. Now the intercept is the predicted value when male is 0, which means it's the predicted value for male, right? And female. Yes, scratch that, female. Yes. The predicted value for female, and then I was getting ahead of myself in my head, and then when I look at the gamma for that, right, a 1 unit change is a change from female to male, right? That's how dummy coding works. But that's not the only kind of coding that there is, right? There's effects coding, there's contrast coding. And again, for dichotomous variables, I think dummy coding is probably simplest and most popular, but there are lots of other ways that you could code dichotomous variables. But again, I wouldn't expect you to be an expert in like all different contrast and effects coding kind of stuff, because we really focus more on dummy coding. But yeah, so when I say dummy coding, this is what I mean. But I could code this. I could code this like this: -1 and +1. If I code it -1 and +1 instead of 0 and 1, what's my intercept mean now? Like, yeah, I mean, if I could assume there are equal numbers of males and females, let's say, right, then it's actually going to give me the average, right? The intercept is now, instead of the intercept being the predicted value for the reference group, the intercept is going to be like the predicted value overall. That's kind of nice, right? And what would a 1 unit change be? It would be a change from the overall average and you're changing from the overall average to male. So it's like, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same parameter estimate that you got when you dummy coded, right? And because a 1 unit change is really just taking you from the overall average to male in the way that this is coded. I don't really love that. I said, you know, when I use effects coding, I tend to use -1/2 and +1/2 personally. And I like that because now a 1 unit change still is the change from male to female, but I still get the intercept being the average overall, which is kind of nice, right? Those are probably the most common ways to code dichotomous variables, but yeah, but this is the one we really expect you to be worrying too much about other ones. Now, coding gets a lot more complicated when you have more than a dichotomous variable, right? What do you do if you've got a variable that has 3 categories? Yeah, you're going to need 2 dummy variables, or you're going to need 2 effects coded variables or 2 contrast coded variables. Once you get more than dichotomous, that's actually where the coding systems, you know, there's a lot more subtlety in terms of thinking about how to code variables, but we are not going there for this class right now. Good to know though. Okay. What else? Oh yeah, we spent a lot of time, I feel like, thinking about how decision making for eliminating variance components. I mean, I put random effects / variance components, right? Because we're really sort of, the variance components are the parameters, but the random effects are sort of what gets eliminated from the equation, right? Often, I mean, sometimes not, but I mean, sometimes I feel like if we're eliminating a covariance, then we're eliminating a covariance component, but not a random effect. But we spent a lot of time sort of thinking about decision making for how to determine, you know, which random effects we might need, sort of what the structure of that variance covariance matrix might be, right? And we spent a lot of time. I think most common method for thinking of, one of the best methods that's most common for thinking about that, of course, goes back to comparing the fit of 2 different models. So it goes back to those likelihood ratio tests, right? And we've got nested models there. So we use the likelihood ratio test. I mean, there are a couple of other things you could do as well, but I think that, you know, again, that's the one that we emphasize the most. Okay, what else did I miss on my, let's see. Oh, of course, it wouldn't be a final exam if I didn't ask you to calculate at least one predicted value, right? Nothing super complicated, but be able to think about calculating a predicted value either from a longitudinal model or from an organizational model. And I think those are kind of the big picture items I feel like that we talked about all semester long. So those are kind of the things that you want to make sure you're familiar with. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I would like you to have good subscripts. I think that the they have something like I by day equal to not plus gamble, not by j, right? Plus uh plus r model. Here, obviously, I'm not allowing the SES to randomly vary, right? Because if I were, 1J. Oops. Yep. Stop, no, wait. And then come down here. You, so 1J. Yep. J, R. J, okay, there we go. So like, which subscripts are most important? I don't know what I'm doing. I'm opening all kinds of things. So which subscripts are most important to me? Well, like these subscripts need to know, right? Like what kind of variable it is, right? Like I'm not worried about you're putting the sub ij on SES. Like that's not something I'm gonna be too concerned about. If you were to write this without those, I mean, so technically this is right. It is SESIJ. It varies within person, so it varies within person and within cluster. But like that I feel like doesn't really change the meaning of the equation. So like if you miss those, I wouldn't be too concerned. But like these are important, right? Like the position is important. Because and gamma not, I hope everybody is clear on this by this point in the semester. The name is gamma not 1, right? So like what's the difference between gamma 1 not and gamma not 1? Yeah, right. So this is telling me that this is like if this is an effect on the intercept, right? And it's like this is the first predictor variable, right? And the intercept. So gamma not 1 would be if I had a level 2 variable in here. If I had 1 times E. Okay, I really need to move that box. Hold on. That would be a better solution. Okay. Right now, this is you're not sub ij, right? So, and this is now saying that mean SES is predicting the randomly varying intercept, right? So that's a very different thing from here. We've got the SES variable at level 1, right? This is my first level 1 predictor. So this is like the intercept of the slope. This is always. 0 is kind of always like an intercept. Right? So this is like the intercept of the first slope, right? This is like a level 2 this is a level 2 variable's effect on the intercept. So these I think are really important. And I mean, I think it's important to have, right, 1. So I think that notation, I think those subscripts are the most important. But again, like if you were to write this out without the J's and the IJs, I wouldn't take off for that. Yes. What about the tell matrix?
Yeah.
I love the tell matrix. Reverse 01 and the 1, like it, right? Tau not, tau 1, right? And we've got tau not 1, tau 1 not. If you were to write this with those reversed, I would not care. But, and again,
That's the right way.
yeah, that's the right way. I always double check myself. Yeah, that's the right way because it's matrix notation. And so matrix notation is always row up. And so, right, this is my one, two, actually it's row 0 and 1 rotation. Technically, right? And then this is column 0. You're right. Double checking. You're right. Okay. But you'll always remember how it goes because you'll know it's row and then column. Yeah, I don't know why did I flip that. That's really bad. But anyway, yes. So clearly, if I messed it up in our review session, I'm not going to take off if you put 0, 1, and 1, 0 because it really doesn't matter. Because the important thing to know is that they are things, right? This, and so there's really only one unique element there. So when we're counting elements, we've got 3. When you count an element, one, it doesn't really matter. I mean, in some sense, it would probably be more logical if a person just wrote out how not one in both places to show that it's equal, but that isn't the way the notation is. You know what I mean? Like, it would probably make more sense to just write, but that's not what people do because they use matrix notation, and it's always row then column. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So what was the question? So gamma not one versus gamma one not, right? So remember that in the first position, we're really sort of talking about like which equation does this go to, right? In our multi-level equation. So I'm talking about like the intercept is 0, right? Our first level 1 predictor is going to be like 1, right? So it'd be like our first level 1 slope. If we had a not, this would be like our second level, right? And we go to the second level 1 slope, not, this would be going to the third level 1 slope. So like if I had a gamma 3 not in my model, I would know that I must have 3 level 1 predictors in my model. Right? Whereas here, this is just saying, okay, intercept, right? And I've got a level gamma. This is just the intercept of the intercept, right? But here I've got the intercept, and this is going to be like the first level 2 predictor. So it's the slope of the first level 2 predictor on the intercept. So this is really telling about sort of the positionality of the like level 2 variable in relation to what's going on, right? So if I have gamma 1, let's say, for that, say. So it's like, yes, this is going to be like a level 2 variable predicting a level 1 slope. And what do we call that thing, by the way? We've got a term for that. Cross-level interaction, right? This is telling me about a level 2 variable, and this is telling me about level 1 slope, and it's saying that there's a level 2 variable predicting a level 1 slope, which another way of thinking about that is it's a level 2 variable moderating a level 1 slope. Okay, so cross-level interaction. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. If there are 2 non-zero numbers, it's a cross-level interaction of some sort. That's absolutely true. That's a good generalization. Right? Any other questions about this notation? It's the notation's getting a little bit easier than like beginning of semester, yeah. Okay. I know it takes a while to wrap your head around all of the subscripts. I get that. But once you do, it's actually really helpful because it does actually the positioning and the numbering does tell you quite a bit. Okay, what other questions do you have for me? Yes. Oh, what's an aggregate? So aggregate just means to like take the mean of something, right? So like aggregate to the higher level is like just like take the mean of it at like so if I aggregate math scores to the school level, it means I'm taking the school mean of the math scores. Oh, and oh yeah, and if I say add the aggregate back in at level 2, that means add the mean back in at level 2. That's the new variable. So like, remember when so this came up a lot in group mean centering. So remember when we group mean center, probably good. Let's just remind ourselves, right? So group mean centering. So I've got, let's say my variable is SN, okay? And so I've got an SES variable, and it's measured at level 1, right? But we know that like SES is going to have a within school component and a between school component. So different kids come to, right? SES is a kid level, it's like a family level variable. Think of it as a kid level variable. But different schools have different average SES, right? So some schools have lots of kids of low SES and not very many kids of high SES, and other schools have lots of kids with high SES and not very many kids with low SES. And so obviously, like the mean SES of schools differs, right? And like if that weren't the case, if in every school we had a nice like full distribution of SES, like then well that'd be a better world in a lot of ways, but then there wouldn't be any between school variance in SES, right? But generally speaking, that's not the way things work. So SES, even though it sits at level 1, it has both within school variability and between school variability. And how could you figure out how much between school variability an independent variable has? Well, I've got this independent variable I'm going to add, and I want to know, is there a lot of between school variability in my independent variable? What do I do? The variance decomposition, right? And the simplest way to think about that is just to compute the ICC, right? I could compute the ICC for SES, and that would tell me how much between school variance is there in SES, right? Is there a lot? Is there a little? Okay, but I digress. So I've got SES. It's just it is a level 1 variable, but even though it sits at level 1, it's sort of lurking in that variable is both level 1 variance and level 2 variance. And when this whole idea of group mean centering and adding the aggregate back in at level 2 is meant to really try to separate out the within cluster and the between cluster variance. So what do? I take SES, right? Well, the first thing I do is I compute the mean for the school on SES, right? So I could compute like school mean, what it is. And so if I take SES minus school mean SES, and this is going to vary by schools. It's not like the overall mean of SES across everybody. That would be one way of centering. That's grand mean centering. But this is like, what's your school mean SES, right? Then I get SES CWC, right? Plus within context or cluster mean centered, right? Or you could think of that, I guess, I get minus, except minus school mean SES. Sometimes people go as SES underscore like underscore mean or whatever. Okay, doesn't matter. So we've got SES that's now school mean centered, right? But the problem is that because I've pointed out a different mean from every person, from every different school has a different mean, right? So what is this SES CWC? It really only gives me where you are in relation to your school's mean. It doesn't tell me anything about where you are in relation to the overall mean or anything about, like, I've lost all of the information about how schools are different from each other or how you compare to the overall sample. So you can imagine two different people in two different schools, and they might both be 3 units above their school's mean, right? But 3 units above your school's mean in a high SES school means you're super rich. And 3 units above your school's mean in a low mean SES school means you're not as poor as the other kids in your school, but you're not super rich. So this variable is like, but it's all sitting in the same variable. So +3 is really just telling where you are in relation to your own school. So what do we need to do? Well, that's why we need to take this school and that, which is an aggregate, right? It's like it's the SES of everybody in the school aggregated up to that next level, like, right? It's like a level 2 variable. So there's no within school variability. And we need to add this aggregate, which just means like aggregated from the level 1 up to the level 2. We're going to add this aggregate back in at level 2. And most commonly, we're probably going to do what to the level 2 variable? Grand mean center it, right? You can't group mean center a level 2 variable, remember. You can only leave it uncentered or grand mean centered. And for interpretation purposes, it's really nice to grand mean center it. So there we take and from that, we're across all the schools, right? And then we would include the within cluster variable. And this is now, if you think about it, there is no variability within clusters. It's a level 2 variable, right? Every kid in the school has the same school mean SES. So there's no way that this variable can explain within cluster variance. And the same thing is true here. This variable only varies, like it's a within cluster variable. I like pulled out all the between cluster variance when I subtracted out that aggregate, that school mean SES, right? So this variable can only within cluster variance, right? So what I've done is I've basically taken one variable, which was this combination of within cluster and between cluster variance, and I've split it apart into 2 variables. One variable that can be a predictor that can explain within cluster variance, and the other variable that can be a predictor that explains between cluster variance. And so it's like a nice, neater kind of partitioning there. Going back to the question about smush, if I just take SES, and if instead of doing this, I just take SES. This is just that SES. This is what Lisa Hoffman refers to as a smush coefficient. I think Chris Preacher calls it a conflated. I don't know. You can use whatever term you like that means the same thing. Smushed is a little more, I don't know. It's a little more graphic. I think it sort of resonates maybe better. Because, and why is it smushed? Why is this a smushed coefficient? Because, yeah, it has both. I haven't tried to disentangle the within and the between. And the really interesting thing about this is that you won't even get the same thing you would get from a multiple linear regression. So like, I think at first blush, and this is something I didn't necessarily understand when I first started out doing multi-level modeling. I just sort of assumed, okay, it's a smushed coefficient, but it's going to give me what I would have gotten if I had run a multiple regression, because a multiple regression also has sort of the same problems, right? But it really doesn't. And that's because you have different sample sizes at level 1 and level 2. And so this smushed coefficient, it actually gets, the weighting is sort of a function of the sample sizes at level 1 and level 2. And so the smushed coefficient, it doesn't give you the within cluster coefficient, it doesn't give you the between cluster coefficient, and it doesn't even actually, well, let me say this. So you've got this sample size issue, and then there's also another issue, which is that, do you remember when we talked about contextual effects? What's a contextual effect? Yeah, the difference between the between and the within. So if you sort of imagine that I had this model, let's say we're having y sub ij equal to gamma naught plus gamma naught 1 times minus yes, right? Plus gamma naught times like all the random effects, but we're not going to worry about the random effects right now, okay? So, okay, so right, so here, this is the effect of mean SES on the outcome, but how I remember how I interpret it depends on what I did in terms of centering, right? So if I group mean center, I said I group mean center. So if I group mean centered SES, am I controlling for SES when I get this coefficient? Like, do I have to say after controlling for this? No, why not? Because I took it out. And remember, this is the other big word of the semester. They're orthogonal. They are completely uncorrelated. That orthogonal means they're completely uncorrelated with each other. The way that I created these two variables, they're completely uncorrelated with each other. The level 1 variable can't explain any level 2 variance. The level 2 variable can't explain any level 1 variance. And if you were to run the correlation, because these are sitting in your data file, if you were to run the correlation between these two variables, you would see that it's actually 0. They're completely uncorrelated with each other, which is what orthogonal means. So, okay, so back to this. So I don't have to say, actually, that, that this is the effect of mean SES on the outcome after controlling for the within, because this is group mean center. So I'm going to get a gamma 1, and gamma naught 1, is that equal to gamma 1 naught? If it's equal, that actually means that SES, it like functions in the same way, like within it's like, right, the sort of its predictive ability is sort of, it functions in the same way within cluster and between cluster, right? So this predictor has like the same magnitude. So it'll be like within schools, SES predicts math achievement, and this is what the coefficient is. And between schools, SES predicts math achievement, and this is what the coefficient is. And those two coefficients are equal to each other. So like the within school effective SES on math achievement is the same as the between school effective SES on math achievement. That's it. If we got something like that, that's what we would say is and so actually, if there's no contextual effect, right, if there's no contextual effect, then using grand mean centering isn't nearly as much of a problem because, with a grand mean centering without adding the aggregate back in, because actually added grand mean centering and adding the aggregate back in is another way to sort of solve the same problem. But grand mean centering without adding the aggregate back in, if you think about it, I only get a gamma 1 naught. I don't get a gamma naught 1. So like implicitly, what's my model saying about this? They're equal, that there is no contextual effect because I haven't split it out into two variables and allowed there to be two different effects. I am implicitly saying actually that there is no contextual effect. So if there is a contextual effect, right? And if the sample size, and again, because we've got different sample sizes at level 1 and level 2, that sort of plays into some of this too, in terms of the weighting and everything. But especially if there is a contextual effect, then the estimate that we get from the grand mean centered SES variable, it isn't just going to be like, it isn't going to be the same thing you get from multiple regression. It's not just going to be this like, it is going to be some kind of weird mix of the two things, but it's not so easy, like it's a weird mix. It's not so easily interpretable. You haven't sort of partitioned things out in such a nice way to be able to kind of, interpret it the way you might like. And so That's what these smushed or conflated effects are all about. Now remember, what if I grand mean center? This is a review. What if I grand mean center? Is by grand mean centered, how is the gamma going to be the same or different from the gamma 1 naught for the group mean? Or sorry, let's talk about from this model going to be similar to or different from the model where I group mean centered. Yeah, now it is the contextual effect, right? Now I do have to say that this is the effect of mean SES after controlling for students SES. So the idea here is like, imagine, like I'm controlling for the same kind of student individually, but they attend 2 different kinds of schools. So imagine I take a student of average SES in this school of average SES, right, versus that same student of average or, prototypical student, right? Like this is all a thought experiment. Take that same student of average SES and put them into a school that has high mean SES. And then this gamma naught 1 is now giving you what would the difference in achievement be there? It's the same kind of student. The only thing that's changed is the school. And that's exactly what the contextual effect is all about. It is what the effect of school holding like person constant, holding whatever, the level 1 stuff constant. So here, gamma naught 1 is and gamma 1 here is going to actually be equal to the, it's actually going to be equal to like the difference between gamma naught 1 and gamma 1 naught from your group mean centered model. So it's going to actually be, it's going to be gamma naught minus gamma naught 1 minus gamma 1 naught. Not 1 correct. Does that make sense? Yeah.
You usually add back in then?
Oh, well, yeah, because remember, if we don't, that's actually the smushed or the conflated model. Like if we just took grand mean center and we don't put the aggregate back in, well, if we didn't put the aggregate back in, we wouldn't even get a gamma naught 1, right? Because the gamma naught 1 is actually
Both of them.
so for both of them, we're adding aggregate back in. And it turns out that like if you grand mean center or group mean center and you add the aggregate back in at level 2, both of those are, again, there are differences in terms of how you would interpret things. And there are lots of people who would say you should always do group mean centering, but really grand or group mean centering and adding the aggregate back in at level 2 are both acceptable choices. You're really going to find differences in interpretation for that gamma naught 1. The gamma 1 naught is really not actually going to change appreciably across the 2 models. Again, it might not be exactly identical, but it's going to be approximately the same actually across those 2 models, the grand and the group mean centered. Where you're really going to see the big differences aren't in the gamma 1 naught, the big differences are in the gamma naught 1 across those 2 models. But yeah, if you only put in SES grand mean centered and you don't add the aggregate back in, then you don't have this gamma 1 naught 1, and that's why I was saying that means you're implicitly making the assumption that gamma naught 1 and gamma 1 naught are the same because you only have gamma 1 naught. So you must be thinking you don't need to partition it out into 2 different pieces and look at how the effects might differ across the 2 levels. Because if you thought that, you would have done that, right? The grand mean centered model just assumes that there is no contextual effect. What could you do to figure out if there's contextual effect? See if you need to do this or not. Maybe, I don't know. That's not what I was thinking, but like, do the model, right? I mean, to know if there's contextual effect. I mean, the ICC is going to tell you if there's within and between cluster variance. Technically, You could still have no contextual effect and have an ICC. So that wouldn't necessarily get you all the way there. I think it's a good start. But like, the best way to know is just, I mean, you could fit this model, right? You could fit this model and see, again, are these two coefficients equal? If you, right, if you group mean centered, or if you grand mean centered, this coefficient should be. By grand mean centered, and there's no contextual effect. It should be 0, right? So I could grand mean center, and I could then check to see if gamma naught 1 is actually 0 or is statistically significantly different from 0 or not. And if it's not, if I were to grand mean center and find that this is not different from 0, that would actually suggest, oh, okay, I could actually just put grand mean centered at level 1 and not worry about doing this whole thing. But I'll tell you, more often than not, you're going to find the contextual effect. Yeah.
Positive or negative, like, could you? I don't know what are negative.
Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, well, so it just means like. I didn't get it out at every step, unfortunately. But like, if I have a positive contextual effect, so let's go with my SES example, right? So if I have a positive contextual effect, so gamma 1 naught is equal to positive, let's say, right? Or the contextual effect is positive. So gamma naught 1 is positive in the grand mean centered model, because that's where we would be looking at contextual effects, right? So grand. Okay, and let's assume that, so the gamma naught 1 is positive. So what does that mean? It means, okay, take those two different, take the kid who's of whatever, like average SES, let's say, right? And average SES overall, and I put him in a school of average SES, and then I put him in a school of high SES, right? And that kid is going to do better when I put him in a school of high SES. That's what that positive contextual effect means, right? So like holding the kid's SES constant, the higher the SES of the school, the better the achievement, which makes sense. I mean, that's kind of what you would probably expect, right? So again, you can think of it as holding constant, student SES, schools with higher SES do better. Now, I can see why you're like, well, what does negative mean? Because it just is like going to be the same logic, but it's sort of not what we would expect to see, right? So what does that mean? It means holding student SES constant, the higher the SES of the school, the lower the achievement of the school, right? That's a negative contextual effect. Now, again, there are places where negative contextual effects could make a lot more sense than this particular example. If you got a negative contextual effect here, the first thing I would say is like, you're making a mistake with your coding or your censoring. I mean, right? Because like, so my priors are pretty strong there about, I kind of feel like higher SES schools, again, on average, again, you might find a high SES school where achievement is lower, but these are our fixed effects. So these are like, on average across all of the schools in our sample, this would be saying that like higher SES, after controlling for student SES, higher SES schools tend to have lower achievement, which seems weird, but that's what it would mean. Well, no, because the contextual effect is like controlling for the students, right? It's like the school effect. It's like, so assuming, again, it'd be like take students of average SES or two groups of students of average SES, put one group in a school of average SES, put the other group in a school that's 1 unit above the average SES, and that coefficient is telling you about the change you would expect to see in the achievement if you to move that group of average students from a school of average SES to a school that's 1 unit above average on SES. So if it's positive, that means moving them from an average SES school to a higher SES school actually increases their achievement. But if it's negative, it means moving them from the average SES school to the high SES school is actually going to decrease their achievement. And by the way, that also means moving them from an average SES school to a low SES school would be predicted to increase their achievement, right? Because it works both ways, which is why you're like, I don't know, that doesn't seem right, but it is right. But that's why it's funky in this particular example. It's not what we would expect to see, but that's what it means. But there might be other examples where negative contextual effects actually have, like, might be what you would even expect to see in your particular research study, but not maybe this example. Yep. Okay. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. One, if I were to say one point for one unit, that is the raw score unit, right? So you don't need the standard deviations in that case. If I say, and again, that's what our parameter estimates are telling us about one raw score unit. As X increases by 1 unit, how do we expect Y to increase or decrease? That's what regression coefficients are telling us. The reason that I threw in standard deviation units is because a 1-point change might not actually, often is not meaningful, right? And so, like, when you're writing stuff up, just saying like, well, as SES changes by a point, this is how much people's achievement would be expected to change. Like, well, if you read that in an article, what would be the first thing you would want to know? Like, what the heck is a point? What is an SES point? What does that mean, right? And what's the easiest way to make sense of that is to put it in standard deviation units, right? Because especially for things that have no real inherent metric of their own, some things you don't need to do that with because there's a logical raw score metric and people can sort of think in the raw score metric. Like if you were doing height and weight, as a kid, let's say as a, babies, as a baby, whatever, a kid increases by 1 inch, I expect their weight to increase by X number of pounds. You don't need to do standard deviation units there. And I would argue that would actually kind of probably be harder for people to understand in that case because people can think in the raw score units. But a lot of times we're doing stuff where the raw score unit doesn't make any sense. And so, like, again, going back to SES, so a 1-point change, maybe it doesn't have any meaning. So then I want to say, oh, no, I want to say for a 1 standard deviation unit change in X, I would expect this much of a change in Y, right? And so that's where we say, oh, okay, well, like I'm gonna sort of think of this in standard deviation units so that I can make sense of like whether, again, it's sort of a way of sort of like very much like an effect size. Like now I have a sense of like how big a change I would expect to see for a standard deviation unit change in X. All that to say that same is true for predicted values. Like if I'm going to make a predicted value, it should be a person that a person could kind of wrap their head around. So if I just say like, if they're 1 unit above the mean on this and 1 unit above the mean on that, and I don't know what a unit means, that's really hard for somebody to like understand what your predicted value person is like, because you're trying to paint a picture. This whole predicted value thing is like, you're painting a picture of a prototypical person for your reader, right? And so, so sometimes it really makes a lot more sense to like think about things in terms of standard deviation units instead of raw score units. So bottom line though is if I say 1 point or 1 unit, that's means like raw score, right? If I say 1 standard deviation or 1 standard deviation unit, that means that you're going to use the standard deviation in there. By the standard deviation. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So just, just remember, if it says standard deviation, you're going to use the standard deviation, right? If it doesn't say standard deviation, you don't need to use the standard deviation.
Yeah, I think just like the coefficient times how type of thing different than the type of thinking we're.
But yeah, and you're right. I mean, although if I said half a point, it would be, well, it'll only be two things then, right? Because it would be 1/2 times the coefficient. So here, you're right. If it's like 1/2 unit, it's gonna be 0.5 times the coefficient. Whereas here, it's gonna be like 0.5 times the integration. Yeah.
That was like my goal.
Yeah. Yeah. So don't let that trip you up. My advice to you. Yes.
On the determining if HLM is needed, obviously conceptually, and then the stuff.
Yeah, I think
What would be the next other thing?
to me, ICC and reliability are probably the biggies, right? Like if you were to compute an ICC and the ICC is 0, or if you were to compute those and again, the reliability is actually a function of the ICC. And I mean, the sample size of the cluster is in there too, but like if you get an ICC of 0, you're going to get a reliability of 0. You know? So anyway, yeah, so like if you compute an ICC of 0, or you compute like an ICC and it's like really, really, really close to 0, or like the reliability is really, really, really close to 0, those are the things that I would use to determine whether a multi-level model is needed. And remember, we're computing those things on the outcome variable. And ICCs can differ across outcome variables for the same sample of people in a study. So it is possible that you could be looking at, let's say you're looking at students' self-concept and their math achievement, and you might find that the ICC for math achievement is like 0.2, and maybe the ICC for self-concept is, 0.05, right? Like there's just a lot more, but which is kind of what I would expect to see. I'd expect to see a lot more between school variability in terms of achievement than I would in terms of self-concept. Maybe I'd be wrong, but that would be my expectation anyway. So yeah, those are the biggies to me. Other questions? Yes.
Earlier you. Calculating the number.
Oh, yeah, for the number, yes. Let's just go over that one more time. So the number of unique elements in the tau matrix, right? So that you don't, so remember, if you want to know the number of unique elements in the tau matrix, right? And so I'm going to have, it's the number of random effects times the number of random effects plus 1 divided by 2. When I say the number of random effects here, so we're going to be counting the intercept plus the slopes, right? Because we're really trying to kind of capture the dimension here. And the first element here would be for the intercept, right? 1, let's say. Ooh. Slope 1, slope 2. So we've really got 4 by 4 columns. Let's use this formula. It's going to be 4 times 4 plus 1, which is 5, which is 10, right? And if you think about it, that makes sense because we're going to get L1, L2, L3. You can have some little weird thing right here that erased it. Go. And then I'm just going to put X's for our unique covariances. We're going to X, 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 right? And so if you look at that, we've got 4 variances. We've got 6 covariances, right? Here, but don't let that fool you, because how many total number of variance covariance components would not be 10? It would be 11, because that is squared, right? What else? How are you feeling about this whole thing? Yes, question?
say again the how to say the interpretation of polynomial coefficient of interest.
Oh, yeah, yes, I can. And then just, it is to keep in mind that to really get a more useful interpretation, you kind of want to come up with the predicted values or graph, right? Like polynomials, the interpretations are maybe not as obviously interpretable at the outset, but let's talk about it. So we've got, for the polynomial term, the first thing that we've got is the zero or polynomial, really just, so just really estimating a level. So that's, so you have an intercept, you're just estimating a level. There is no change in level. So the change in level is zero. Okay. First order, linear is what we spend the most time on. So we've got an intercept and a slope, which is really, so intercept is level, and you can think of slope as change in level. But remember, there is no change in the change in level here. So we've got a constant rate of change, right? And so we can think of here as the intercept is the predicted value when, you know, again, usually we center time at zero, so it'll be the predicted value when time is zero, and the slope is just like this constant rate of change, right? As when, you know, for every unit change in time, how much does the outcome variable change? But now when we get to quadratic, right, we've got an intercept and we've got a first order. What this looks like. Remember that we've got like beta, right, plus beta times, I'm just gonna call it coefficient plus our second order coefficient, right? Or not coefficient, our second order, you know, variable. This is actually our time variable. So we often will code this and the second looks like 0, 1, 4. Remember that? So we square, right? Okay, so now I have to be able to interpret these three intercepts, or these, not intercepts, these three parameters. So the first parameter is overall intercept. So it is still the predicted value when everything else in the model is zero. When is everything else in the model zero? Yeah, like at time zero, right? So, okay, so that's easy. But now the first order slope is really here because there is no constant rate of change anymore. The rate of change is itself changing. And that's really what you can think of this as the change in the rate of change. So it's going to allow the rate of change to change across time. So now there is no constant rate of change. So now the first order slope is the instantaneous rate of change. It has to be the rate of change at a particular moment. So it's the instantaneous rate of change when time is equal to zero. And then the second order slope, because it's the highest order term here, is really going to tell us about the change in the rate of change, right? And we talked a lot about, you know, if it's positive or negative, right? And how you can sort of think about these two in combination. But if it's positive, what that's really telling you is that like, okay, I'm starting off here, whatever this might be, beta 1 naught, but if beta 2 naught is positive, it means that this coefficient, this is the coefficient at time equal to zero, but imagine this coefficient is getting more positive across time. That's really what it's telling you. So it's the change in the rate of change. But if this is positive, saying, okay, you're starting off with some instantaneous rate of change here, which is getting more and more positive across time. Conversely, if this is negative, it's saying, okay, you're starting off with some rate of change at time equals 0. That rate of change is getting more and more negative across time. So that parameter, this parameter is getting more and more negative across time, right? And then finally, last one is cubic. Actually, let me here. I'll add nine. Okay, so I got 0.8. Let's say for our third order slope. The third order time term. Okay, so the way this always works with polynomials, it's very much like the way it works with interactions. You always have to interpret main effects in the context of interactions. You always have to interpret lower order terms in the context of the higher order terms. So before, when I was like, oh, the second order, I just could like think about it just the way I was thinking about it because it was the highest. Now the second order term is not the highest order term anymore. So the second order term is really gonna, like again, it's sort of everything is kind of getting interpreted in this full context now. But okay, be that as it may. Now I've got my intercept. The intercept is still basically going to be the predicted level when time is equal to 0. The first order term is still going to be it's really the predicted instantaneous rate of change, right? When time is equal to 0. But now the second order slope is really like the predicted, it's like the predicted curvature parameter or like the predicted change in the rate of change. So this is this like acceleration or deceleration parameter. How quickly is the change rate changing? Is it getting more positive or more negative? But when, this is the important thing, we have to qualify it and say that this is whether the rate of change is getting more positive or more negative when time is equal to 0. Before I could just say, is it getting more positive or more negative? Because the change in the rate of change, although the rate of change was changing, the change in the rate of change was constant. But now the change in the rate of change is itself changing. So this is the change in the rate of change when time is equal to 0. So it is the, how much is this accelerating or decelerating, right? How much is that changing when time is equal to 0? And then this tells me about the change in the change of the rate of change, right? So, but again, you can also, and this also sort of, this tells us a bit about how many curves we can support here too, the curvature parameters, right? Because like here, when I had a second order, it's like, okay, I've got some sort of instantaneous rate of change that's either speeding up or slowing down. Now I've got an instantaneous rate of change at time 0 that's either speeding up or slowing down at time 0, but this can itself be either sped up or slowed down, right? So, yeah. But again, if you were really going to try to write this up for somebody, this is where you would really want to be, graphing something out or doing predicted values, because if you just start writing ad nauseum about change in the changing rate of change, people are going to want to kill you, right? But conceptually, that's what's going on. Yeah, does that help? Okay, great. And remember, these coefficients to randomly vary. What am I saying? Because these are like the average across the whole sample. But what if I allow this and this and this and this to randomly vary? What am I saying then? If I allow them to randomly vary? If I don't, they're not the same for everybody, right? I mean, if I do, they're not the same for everybody. If I don't, yes, now I'm getting, yes. They are the same for everybody if I don't allow them to randomly vary. If I allow them to randomly vary, then I'm allowing them to be different. What does that mean if they're different for everybody? Chaos in some sense, right? Everybody can have a different starting level. Everybody can have a different, instantaneous rate of change at time is equal to 0. Everybody could have a different like second, like change in the rate of change, every different change in the rate of change. So really like, even though on average, you're gonna get a particular shape here that you could, you could graph the particular shape that you get on average across the sample with your beta coefficients. But really, if these things are randomly varying, especially if those random variances are big, right? Then that's really telling you different people can, different people can have different shapes. And again, I'm saying if they randomly vary, you're allowing people to have different shapes, different coefficients. But it is probably also to remember that the degree of variance is also, once you compute that, the degree of variance is going to tell you about how much those things do vary. So you could allow this thing to randomly vary, and maybe it's not zero, but maybe it's tiny. So maybe that curvature parameter doesn't vary that much across people. But if it does vary a lot across people, people can have wildly different, if all of these things vary a lot across people, people can have really wildly different shapes, right? In terms of their trajectories. And really what you're getting here is just sort of the average across people, which is a good descriptive average across people, but might not well describe any one person in your sample, Other questions? Yes. Okay. Okay. Mhm.
So. Had a lot of. Had a hard time.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. That's a totally fair question. I mean, and I don't think there is necessarily like a simple rule of thumb for those things, just the way that I mean, I suppose there are some simple rules of thumb for multiple regression, but those are meant to be taken with a grain of salt too, right? Like if you explain 1% of the variance in your outcome variable in regression, is that a lot or not a lot? I mean, for us in education, I would say generally speaking, not a lot, right? I mean, although having said that, often we do studies where that's exactly what we find. But anyway, I digress. It doesn't seem like a lot, but if if it were like a life and death scenario, might you care about that 1%? Like maybe you would, right? So I think to a certain extent, like what proportion of variance needs to be explained to like be meaningful sort of depends on the context in which you're talking about. But I would say, so having with that big caveat in mind, I would say, generally speaking, 1% is not a lot. I would say, generally speaking, less than 5% is probably, for the kinds of scenarios that most of us are working in, probably not that exciting. I'm not saying completely negligible necessarily at 5%, but not like, I wouldn't be like doing a happy dance or anything either. Whereas, I think we can all say that, if I'm explaining like a quarter of the variance or more, that feels pretty big, right? And somewhere between 5% and 20. I mean, again, so I think it's a judgment call there, but it also just sort of depends on how much variance you have to begin with. Like if you're looking at the variance in a randomly varying slope and there was very little variance to begin with, sometimes you'll find you're explaining like, over half of the variance, which great, but it's also like, that slope wasn't actually in itself explaining a lot of variance to begin with. So I think you also have to think about it in that context as well. Like the intercept is usually where we see a lot more of the between cluster variance, but like you could have a slope that explains, and that's where I think the Wrights and Sturba stuff kind of comes in handy because it sort of tells you like, well, how much of the variance is this slope explaining to begin, right? Like how much of the variance is really the slope giving me to begin with? Because like if I explain, what I'm trying to say here is like, if I explain 75% of the variance in a slope that only explains 1% of the variance in my outcome variable, that itself is also not that exciting. In the same way that just explaining 1% of my outcome variance is not exciting. So like, don't let the fact that you're explaining 75% of the tau 1,1 lull you into thinking, whoa, that's awesome, because it could be 75% of something that only explains 0.5% of the variance to begin with. And that to me is like the reason that the rights in Sturba, like being able to partition into all of those different pieces is kind of useful because it kind of tells you what proportion of the variance is that slope explaining to begin with, right? And you don't really get that from the proportion reduction in variance things. But yeah, generally speaking, I would say less than 1% is not exciting. And 1 to 5% is not very much, right? Sure. Other questions? I don't even know what time it is. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh. That's at 10:25, but upside down. It's 10:52. I mean, I'd prefer not to take a break if we're about to wind down. But if you all think you have like another hour's worth of questions in you, then we should take a break. But if we're about done, if we're down to the last question or so, I'd say let's just keep going. Yes. Sure. Oh, okay, fair enough. I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, not for this particular context, because I do have lots of article critiques, but this is not the kind of article critique I would be expecting you to do if I were teaching 6601 class, for example. I really, really just want you to focus on the multi-level analysis part, like the description of the multi-level model and the results and the discussion of the multi-level model. You can truly, I mean, again, I would skim the rest of it just so you have a sense of what's going on, because it's really hard to critique the multi-level model if you don't understand what it's a multi-level model of at all. But I'm not expecting you to talk about anything other than the multi-level modeling. So those questions that I gave you that were guiding questions on the homework, those are the questions that if you just focus on making sure you hit those questions, you should be fine. But again, like I don't really have because it's not really a full article critique. If I gave you a full article critique, you would think, oh my God, I have to talk about all this. And no, you don't. You really just focus on the multi-level model part, right? What did they do well? What did they do not so well, if anything, right? What do you think? And whatever I don't remember off the top of my head what my questions were, but they were deliberately written to kind of guide you through the critique. And I think some of them were like, make sure you think about the ICC and right? Yeah. So, and you're not going to get like points are not going to be doled out based on like your, format of it. Although having said that, do write incomplete sentences, but this is not, it really is about, can you read this article and sort of understand, make sense of, and kind of critique the multi-level modeling in the article. It's not like, are you pretending you're a reviewer too on the whole thing or anything? Does that help? And I really struggled with what to put for page amounts. So it's as long as it takes you to do it, right? I mean, I can't imagine somebody would need more than 5 pages, but there are some people in here who are very verbose, which is why I've said 5-page max, and I'm looking at you, Claudia. All right, right? You should but that doesn't mean that I'm expecting people to write 5 pages. It also doesn't mean that the more you write, the more credit you're going to get. Because I will tell you this, believe it or not, I have created somewhat of like an answer key / rubric for this article. So there are particular things guided by those questions that I gave you that I'm looking for you to talk about. So just stick to trying to answer those questions, and I think you'll be fine. And if you answer those questions and it takes you, 2 pages, that's fine. And if it takes somebody else 5 pages, that's fine. It doesn't necessarily mean the 5 pages are going to do better than the 2 pages. So don't try to fluff it up. Just for the sake of fluffing it up would be my advice. That'll just be painful for you and for us while we grade it. Yes.
Of the HLM. So for some
studies, it could be served as a descriptive thing, and some of them would be better to compare the control and treatment model.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Like, and I think this is true of pretty much all the stats that in all the stats classes, right? You learn all these analytic techniques, but the analysis doesn't say anything in particular about the design of the study, right? And I should probably end the whole semester by saying it's really common in the multi-level parlance to talk about effects, random effects, fixed effects. That's just that's the language tradition that has grown up. But it is to remember that when multi-level modelers talk about effects, that doesn't necessarily imply that they're causal effects. If you do a randomized controlled trial or a cluster randomized controlled trial, then you can talk about causal effects of interest, right? But when we talk about effects, that's just kind of the terms that we use. And so just because you run a multi-level model doesn't, like, yeah, you could run a multi-level model that's purely descriptive. I'm just describing the relationships among these variables, or right, in the same way that you could run a regression model that's really much more descriptive, and it's not like a causal model, or you're not doing an experimental study. So absolutely, this could be used for more descriptive purposes, or it could be, or more like observational purposes, like this is what we're seeing in the world and this is how this predicts this, or it could be used for specific, like studies with experimental designs, or regression discontinuity designs, or whatever your design might be. Yeah, absolutely.
If that's purpose, like we need to, for example, we compare like these schools and these schools, for example, the different new technique of teaching, and do we need to get a baseline for both of them, or let's say like test the growth model of that, and for the time zero, is that like with the treatment, right?
Yeah, I mean,
But like before that, we need a baseline for.
well, I mean, I think so now you're asking questions that I think relate back to the design of your study, right? Is your study designed to look at growth, or are you looking at just sort of differences in the outcome? Generally speaking, it's always good to have pre-measure as a covariate. Like, can't think of too many downsides of collecting baseline data when you're doing any kind of experimental or quasi-experimental study, especially quasi-experimental studies, actually, but even experimental studies, it's super helpful to have baseline data. So, I mean, I think it's good to have baseline data, whether or not you're measuring growth, but yeah, I mean, I think, again, you can take any design study, and if you have this clustering, then you can use multi-level modeling, right?
Those, like, will that baseline like be put in the HLM model or no? Like,
Well, yeah, I know. So if you had baseline data, if you have baseline data and you're using it as a covariate, so let's say you have prior achievement, right? And you're going to use it as a covariate. So it would just go in as a covariate. And then the question is, are you going to put it in at level 1, or are you going to break it out and put it in at level 1 and 2? And then are you going to group mean center or gram mean center? But yeah. So absolutely. Sure. Anything else? Yes, Mark.
For the test, is paper test?
It is a paper test. I personally think it's easier to work on paper than it is to work on the computer. So you will be getting a paper test, and you're welcome to use scrap paper if you want. I don't honestly think you'll need it. There is there's a tiny bit of very simple computation, but I mean, so I would recommend having a calculator. That could be your cell phone, by the way. I mean, you don't have to bring a separate calculator, but I mean, there's nothing you couldn't do by hand, but you might prefer to have a calculator. And yeah, you can use scrap paper if you want. I don't think you'll need it. I tried to make the spaces big enough for you to be able to have enough space to write stuff. But if you want scrap paper just to be jotting down your notation or something before you write it on the paper, that's fine. Yeah, sure. You can use the Blackboard. Don't go anywhere. That seems, I mean, I'm already a big paper waster, and even I feel like that sounds really wasteful unless you
Well,
feel.
for like, for my fancy.
I was gonna say, unless you're gonna save it for posterity, if you're an army, you probably should print it out. But like, otherwise, I don't know. You know, if you want to print it out, you can, but if somebody feels like they want to access homeworks that they don't have printed out, I think that's fine. You can go on to Husky CT. Again, the no internet thing, there are really two things I want to accomplish with that. I don't want you trying to Google answers, not because I think you're gonna be able to, but just because I think it's a huge waste of everybody's time if you try. And number two, I don't want you communicating with anybody else. Test, and that's probably the most important thing. But yeah, if you want to go online to your homeworks, I don't have an issue with that. Or, you know, easier is, I guess, if you're bringing a device, you know, just download those PDFs, right? Without printing them. And then you don't even have to worry about getting on the internet. You can just access them, right? Like if you have an iPad or something, or even your computer, it's really easy. Yeah. So that's probably easier still. But if you forget to download a homework and you need to go online. Questions? Yeah. Okay, which,
For like, I felt like I was able to determine like if it was a change in level or a change in like slope.
okay.
But
So like, okay, so again, I just like to think of these time variables as sort of, you know, just kind of blocking the passage of time, right? So let's say we have something like this. And if you wanted to look at, and what you just, again, you just always have to stop and think about things really like conceptually. So let's say I want to create a slope and a change in slope after, like, at time, let's say, at time 2 is sort of the beginning of the new phase. So that's, slope is going to change, right, like at/after time 2. Okay, so how would I do that? Doing like slope and change. So let's say I'm doing slope and change. So it's going to change. Well, it's like the new slope is going to begin at 2. But that's the thing, and that's where you have to kind of like really be thinking this through, right? The new slope. So the change in slope. Let's say it looks like this. Here's my study. 0, 1, 2. Right? Like 2 is where I'm changing phase. Right? But if 2 is where I'm introducing the new intervention, then 2 really is going to kind of serve as like the 0, right, for that next slope. Does everybody kind of follow that? So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, right? But now, and this is where maybe it's a little, and again, you just have to really think this through. It's a little bit different from like the change in level, because the change in level is this instantaneous change in level. So if I say, like, this change in level is occurring, like right, like something happens. There's like this big event, monumentous event that changes people. And I collected data right before it, like, you know, time 2 is before the event happens and time 3 is after the event happens, then that's going to be this, right? But if the monumental event happens just milliseconds before I take your score at time 2, because this is like an instantaneous change in level, then it would actually be something like this, right? So you have to think about the change in level, I think, like a little bit differently in terms of like, because it is literally like this thing is changing, it's an instantaneous change in level. Like, is that change in level occurring, you know, like, where is my data collection in relation to that? Did I collect the data right before the change? Did I collect the data right after the change? Whereas with slope, it's not really like that, because like whether I collect the slope like instantaneously before or after this thing that's going to change the slope, it doesn't really matter, because I'm starting the clock ticking and then the slope is changing, right? So it's like a gradual change. It's like a change in the growth rate. So do you see what I mean? Like it's kind of like if a bomb hit, doesn't matter whether the bomb hit right before or after you collected your data, whereas this like change in slope is going to be like, oh, okay, now I'm starting this new time clock, and the clock is gonna start ticking at this moment, and it's gonna keep ticking. But like, I will make it very clear if there, you know, what the scenario is. Like, if I were to ask about a change in level, I would make sure to say, the change in the level that occurs, right, like, right before, right after, whatever, so that you would know how to code that, so that you wouldn't be like, I wouldn't be like, it occurs at time two, you guess if it's like, you know, I would make sure that I use language that would not make, but you would know how to code the change in level. But that is like a good thing to think about when you're actually thinking about doing this coding on your own, because you really do kind of have to know with the change in level, like, you know, where is this event occurring? And often the event is occurring actually between two time points. Especially like with naturalistic studies, like in a lab, it might be a little different, but we're collecting observational data. Things happen when people are not right with us. Okay. Anyway, did that answer that question? Yeah. Sure.
And the test isn't gonna be
Not gonna be what?
R, we're not using.
There is not a word of code on the test. There's nothing, it's not an R-based test. Not at all. If you understand multi-level modeling, even if you never figured out how to run R, you should still be able to get a good grade on this test. I'm hoping that that's not the case for anybody in here, but if it is, like, your test grade will not depend on your R proficiency in the. So I think that the markdown files could be helpful because there's like verbiage in them that is conceptual, but you should not spend your time trying to like worry about coding stuff, because there's nothing about coding on the file at all. Yeah? Does that make you feel better? Okay. Last call for questions. Great. So I will see you here next week. Just as a reminder, I will be here as early as 8 if anybody wants to start that early. And I will stay as late as 12. Well, actually, no, to be fair, a couple things. To be fair, I will be trading off with the TAs next week, because as it turns out, we do have a campus visit for like a tenure line assistant professor is going to be on campus doing a visit next week on this date. So there are times I'm going to have to leave the TAs here. And there are other times that I will be here. And on that note, we do have, I'll send it out to all of you via email, but we have three people coming to visit campus on Friday, Wednesday, and Thursday of next week. And they'll each be doing a research talk and a teaching talk. So I'll send out information to the class email, because it's like too much to go through right now and have you write it all down. But I would encourage you all to come. I mean, obviously, if you're in Army, really encourage you to come. But even if you're not, because this is a person, whoever we hire is a person who's going to be teaching, you know, stats classes here, probably both intro and advanced classes. And I think it's really helpful to get feedback from people in all different programs about both, especially the teaching talk. Do you think this is somebody you could learn from as a teacher? And then also I think the research talks are pretty interesting as well. So I will send all that information, and just know you're invited to come to the research and the teaching talks if you're available. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Cool. So if there isn't anything else, I will see you all next week. Oh yeah, let me turn that off the recording. Yes, it was. Okay.
What if your beginning of the day spiel?
Stop. Yeah, there we go. 2:09.